In this lesson, we'll take a look at the presidencies, first of John Adams and then Thomas Jefferson. We'll start out with Adams, of course, because he came first. Now, the election of 1796, which saw Adams to the presidential office, was a very close election. You see, the way it worked was the electoral voters, those who had been essentially delegated by the state in some way or another, they cast a vote at the Electoral College for the presidential candidate. And whoever got the most votes became president, but whoever got the second most votes back at this time became vice president. So what that meant was it meant you could have a president from one political party and you could have a vice president from a completely different political party. That'd be like having, say, a Democrat president and a Republican vice president in our own day and age, which is kind of unthinkable to us in our factional politics. But even so, Adams and Jefferson, that's exactly what happened to them. Adams received the most votes in 1796, so he earned that highest office in the land. And Jefferson, who came in second, was Adams' vice president. Now, Adams immediately wrote to Abigail. When he learned the news that he was president, he wrote to her that he wasn't exactly eager to take on this position. In fact, here's what he said. He said, "I hate speeches, messages, addresses, and answers, proclamations, and such affected, studied, contraband things. I hate levees and drawing rooms. I hate to speak to 1,000 people to whom I have nothing to say. Yet all this I can do." It's kind of typical Adams right there. He believes that he can do this, and he knows he will do it, even though he really doesn't want to do it. Now, what's curious about this time is Jefferson wrote him a letter, and of course, they had been at odds with each other over things like the whole discourses of Davila debacle and, of course, their disagreements while they were on the cabinet of Washington. And so Jefferson wrote a letter congratulating Adams on becoming president and saying, listen, let's put our past differences behind us. Adams responded with a letter of his own. He said, yes, I agree. Thank you. Let's put our past differences behind us. And in fact, I propose to you that we become partners. In other words, Adams had this brilliant idea that instead of keeping the vice president out of all important decisions, that he actually bring Jefferson in as a partner, and they almost act as if they were both president, making all the decisions for the young United States from there on. It was a brilliant proposal, something that, had it actually happened, would have been unique in all of American history. But of course, it was a proposal that was never accepted by Jefferson, and for a long time, Adams probably had no idea why it wasn't accepted. Still, Adams did become president, and one of his first mistakes was that he decided to keep almost the exact same cabinet that George Washington had. The primary problem with this cabinet was that even though Alexander Hamilton was no longer in the picture directly, he still was in the D.C. area, or in the capital area at the time, and he was still someone who controlled a lot of the decisions of the cabinet. And so Alexander Hamilton really was the one who called the shots. And Alexander Hamilton was someone who despised and hated Thomas Jefferson. So we have this division, we have all of this political intrigue and all of these petty debates going on in the background, which means if there's going to be any great trials, it's probably going to bring out the worst in all of these people at the time. That's, of course, what happened. The first great trial that happened while Adams was president was when France, still somewhat miffed with the fact that the United States had not joined them in their war against Britain, simply decided to begin attacking U.S. ships, kind of in retaliation for us not joining them. And so Adams immediately requested that Jefferson go to France, because Jefferson had formed all these friendships when he was there before, and that Jefferson negotiate a peace treaty with France. Jefferson, listening to the members of his own political party, decided that he would not go. He also made it clear to Adams that the whole idea of a partnership simply couldn't work, that he believed as a vice president he should just kind of stay out of decisions altogether. The height of this came when the two men, having both attended a dinner hosted by George Washington, walked by the spot where they had actually worked on the Declaration of Independence together many years before, and had essentially their last argument, or really what became their Cold War. Much of their fighting was done by simply not speaking to each other. And so Adams was not able to secure Jefferson as a friend, secure him as a partner, or even able to order him to do something as simple as negotiate peace with France. As a result of that, he lost Jefferson. But the other problem was this. Hamilton, who hated Jefferson and who was fiercely loyal to the Federalist Party, believed that Adams was a weak link in the Federalist Party because he had tried to include Jefferson. And so Hamilton began to work against Adams from this time on. Another trial happened. This was called the XYZ affair. And this was where the French attempted to actually bribe our ambassadors who Adams had sent over to Paris to negotiate some form of peace with France. And the bribery was not successful. The U.S. ambassadors refused it. But Adams, seeing this as an embarrassment in the first place, decided just to keep it quiet. However, eventually his secret came out, and the whole country learned in the newspapers that our members, our ambassadors, had been bribed, and they were outraged at the French, but even more outraged at Adams for even allowing it to happen. And so this outrage, combined with the Federalists controlling much of the government at the time, combined with the fact that Hamilton was kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes, led to, in the year 1798, what is infamously known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. These were a series of acts that were aimed at stopping French spies or British spies. They were aimed at keeping us out of a war and keeping our own sovereignty intact. And so what they did was they limited things like citizenship. They made it much harder to become a citizen in the first place. But they also did some incredible things that violated the Bill of Rights. For example, they made it a crime to speak what they called sedition, speak illy of the present government. And in fact, if you spoke a criticism that the current government did not appreciate, you could be charged or even imprisoned for speaking that. So it was a direct violation of freedom of speech or even freedom of press. And so, because people could be imprisoned, or because those who were suspected of being sympathetic to the French or the British could be interned, which is a fancy way of saying imprisoned without trial, many of the people looked at this as really an evil legislation, and Hamilton was really the one behind it. Not so much Adams, but Adams was the one who had his name on it, essentially, because he was the president at the time. The other thing about the Alien and Sedition Acts is they were actually used to imprison many of the candidates running for office who represented the party of Jefferson, those Democrats and Republicans. Meanwhile, Hamilton believed that the war was going to eventually happen in full against France, and he believed it was a great opportunity for the United States to conquer New France. And so we have all kinds of letters written by Hamilton in which he kind of schemes to prepare a standing army. And his idea was that Washington would be called out of retirement to lead it. But Washington, who was quite old at this time, would turn to Hamilton to really be the de facto leader, the one actually in charge. And so we have all this evidence that Hamilton really was behind all of the plans and all of kind of the evil ideas at the time. Still, there was an opposition to all of this, and that came through Jefferson. Jefferson and his young protege, James Madison, wrote something called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves, which essentially argued that any state that saw the Alien and Sedition Acts as being something unconstitutional could simply choose to nullify them. They could simply choose to not obey or practice or enforce those laws because, after all, each of the states were sovereign, independent nations that were joined together under the Constitution. Meanwhile, Adams, who probably agreed with Jefferson, found himself caught in the mix of all these political intrigues and was still under threat of war with France. And so Adams did something very bold. He sent a new delegation to France, and they successfully ordered peace with the French. What's incredible, though, is he did it without any help from the Federalists, and it spoiled Hamilton's plans to conquer New France, or even New Spain, which Hamilton also had his sights on. And so Adams successfully kept us out of war, but he lost all of his political allies, which is one of the reasons he only served one term, because Hamilton, as well as the Democrat Republicans, worked against him in the second. Now, in the election of 1800, which saw Jefferson come to the presidency, as I mentioned, Adams was quickly defeated. He had lost all of his support. But Jefferson wasn't a shoo-in for the office. In fact, Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr, tied for the presidency. Now, the thing was, when you have a tie like that, the vote has to go to the House of Representatives, and they have to vote to decide who becomes president when there's a tie. And so they went through this vote some 35 times, and every time they voted to end the tie, they themselves tied. And so Hamilton, once again, comes into the picture. Hamilton, who has the great influence over most of the Congress as well as the cabinet, decides that he is going to throw his favor for Jefferson to be president. It just seems strange to you because Hamilton hated Jefferson. He did, but he hated Burr even more. And so Hamilton was willing to take Jefferson over Burr. Eventually, Jefferson rode into the new capital of Washington, D.C., just as Adams had left that morning quietly. The two men never even saw each other. The two men were no longer on speaking terms. Jefferson had a remarkable presidency, though. He was able to reduce the national debt by some 30%. He fought one of our great wars. He fought the Barbary Pirate War, in which he sent U.S. ships, which curiously had actually been built under Adams' presidency, to successfully defeat pirates who were attacking our shipping lines. He also purchased Louisiana, that great purchase from the French for 3 cents an acre, which doubled the size of the United States. And then, of course, he sent Lewis and Clark to explore it. But Jefferson's presidency was not without problems. In fact, it was under his presidency that Alexander Hamilton famously fought a duel with Aaron Burr, who he had foiled earlier. In fact, Hamilton, who is kind of a troubled character, we also find that with Hamilton, he's also a very principled man, almost strangely or paradoxically, you could say. In fact, Hamilton was famous for saying things like, "Those who stand for nothing fall for anything." Hamilton himself turned to Christianity later in life, and when Burr finally challenged him to a duel for the many wrongs that he saw Hamilton committing, Hamilton made this decision. He made a decision that he would not actually fight Burr, that he would waste his shot. He would fire in the air, fire to the side. And he wrote his wife explaining why he made this decision. He said this, "The scruples of a Christian have determined me to expose my own life to any extent, rather than subject myself to the guilt of taking another. Heaven can preserve me, and I humbly hope will. But in the contrary event, I charge you to remember that you are a Christian. God's will be done. The will of a merciful God must be good. Once more, adieu, my darling, darling wife." He did waste his shot. Burr had no mercy, shot him directly and full on, and Hamilton died from his wounds shortly after. But died in an incredible faith. That's what makes him one of those interesting tales throughout all of our history. Later in Jefferson's presidency, he would pass things like the Embargo Act, which was an attempt by the federal government to essentially regulate the economy of the states and ended up almost closing down all of our U.S. trade. Eventually it was repealed, but by the time that it was repealed, Jefferson had retired from office. He went home to Monticello. Adams was home at Braintree. They both could have continued their lives having never spoken to each other again. But they did. And that's the story we'll look at in the next lesson.